name is Piotr Palacz. It is shown in the email below the title. The first name is Piotr, P-I-O-T-R. The last name is Palacz, P-A-L-A-C-Z. Somehow my first name creates a lot of problems, especially on the other side of Atlantic, but this is how it is. I'm really excited to be able to present here today, even if perhaps I don't seem sufficiently excited. This is probably because my body is well past its lullaby time. It has been already 17 years since the last time I presented here, and there is probably a reason for that, because I suspect that the last time I presented I beat the absolute record of the length of a single presentation. I think it was like 3 hours or something like that. And it took me 17 years to get over it. So this is why it took so long, to come back. I came last year to Maribor. I didn't present anything, but this time I have 2 presentations. And before I start that one, I would like to extend my warmest feelings of gratitude towards the selection committee for their unusual, subtle and deep analysis of my modest proposals, because it was only 2 months after submitting them that I've seen in the program conference that they were accepted. So it cracked me up. And the reason why I'm grateful is that I finally discovered that there is at least one person in this part of the world with a similar sense of humor. So I'm grateful for that, and thank you. Now, the title is Pharo in the Corner, Cases of the Enterprise. You will probably see during the presentation that many things that I talk about in context of Pharo are not specific to Pharo. They may be applied to other Smalltalks. But the fact is that I've been using Pharo, so this is why I'm talking about Pharo. Also, some of the things that I will be talking may apply also to other technologies and other situations, but then again, because this experience arose in context of using Pharo, I'm talking about it in context of the Pharo. Now, a brief terminological explanation. Corner cases basically means like special cases. I like the expression corner cases because it invokes this idea that Pharo can do something tucked away in a corner somewhere that is still useful in some way. Enterprise here is a very broad concept. Sometimes it means enterprise systems. Sometimes it means just big companies that use complex systems. It doesn't really matter that much precisely what it is. What really matters, it is not a moms and pops kind of shop type of operation, but rather large operations. And in the course of presentation, it will become clearer what I mean by enterprise. So, for example, 20 billions plus budget per year would typically qualify as an enterprise, right? Or a project that has $500 million plus budget probably qualifies as an enterprise, right? So that should be sufficient to put the notion of enterprise on the map. Okay, so here is the quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to talk about background motivation, some driving questions. Then I'm going to talk about those corner cases, 3 of them. Then I'll try to formulate some observations, reflections, suggestions, which reflect my experience, but generally they should be treated more as open questions, a start of a dialogue rather than kind of a definitive statement of how things are. And then at the end, there is the end. All right, so I'll say something about my background, my Smalltalk background. Not that much for self-identification, but because it kind of leads into the topic. My first kind of interesting experience with Smalltalk was 1987. Even though I knew Smalltalk before that, I took the first university course, a semester course, with a guy who was repeating during the course that it's going to be very easy and the exam will be a pure formality. It turned out that the exam took 4 hours and half of the people who took the course didn't pass. So that was, at the time, Central European education is best. Now, in the 90s, most of the 90s, I worked in different dialects of Smalltalk, mainly in enterprise systems, in advertising, banking, insurance, telco, in Australia till 97, and then in the US. I think my last large Smalltalk project was actually in a telco around 2000, 2001. It was basically trying to make a large system work, some provisioning system that was not properly scaling from being used in 3 or 4 different regions of the US into kind of nationwide operation, which basically meant that it took like 40 minutes for the system to start up, which was kind of nonsense. But that was my last experience and work on the large Smalltalk system. It was actually Visual Age. One of the sources of the problem was that it was built using those visual parts things by people who didn't really have much of a clue. So it was kind of interesting experience. Then after that, mainly 200s for the next 20 years, I mainly worked as an architect in different guises. Again, kind of technical solution, application, enterprise, and whatever. In all those industries, I know that in some circles, the title of architect is not treated kindly, and I understand that, but to my defense, I would say that all the time I kind of kept coding, despite or regardless of the titles. 5 years ago, I made a leap and left the big corporate IT. My last big employer was Hewlett-Packard. And I went independent, which is kind of important for the story also. And somehow in 2015, I started using Smalltalk for project work again, starting with Pharo 4, 5, 6. Basically until now, I have a project still going in using Pharo. So that's the story and kind of the introduction to the things that will follow. All right. Because most of that is based on my personal experiences and story, I'd like to say something about my perspective and my potential biases that may be different from yours, and that's only natural. We have different perspectives depending on where you are in the system. There is a different perspective naturally when you work for a company that produces and sells Smalltalks or some Smalltalk solutions versus a big corporation that uses Smalltalk versus, again, for small operators, independents, or kind of small IT companies. So I'd like to take a moment to kind of tell you quickly what it really means, at least in my case, what it means to be independent, which also is kind of relevant to the story. Small teams, small budgets, short time frames. One can enjoy relative freedom of choice in approach and tooling. But then again, the downside is bearing the full risk of the choices made. Full responsibility basically means that your head gets chopped off. Also, it means having to assume broad responsibilities. Right? It's not a very specialized job description. There are many things that needs to be done in order to have some modicum of success. This type of work means having pretty strong pragmatic focus, which means that solutions involve both business and software elements, not just software. It's not purely technical job. It also requires some kind of proactive attitude to things, driving the solution rather than waiting for things to happen. Dealing with the actual reality of heavily underspecified, confused, and sometimes misleading requirements. And also the constraints at the top typically mean that there is a limited opportunity for extended experimentation, which is sometimes important. Okay, so that should be it as a kind of first approximation. Now, the motivation and driving questions for this talk are listed here, and I try to provide some answers based on my experience. Your experience may be naturally different, but what I would really like to achieve through this talk is to keep those kind of driving questions in mind and possibly try to discuss them some more after the talk and later on. So the first question, of course, is what are the areas, if any, where Pharo can be successfully used in an enterprise context? What are the effective ways of introducing Pharo to so-called non-mainstream technology-averse organizations, and so forth. So these are the questions I'm interested in. I may not supply all the questions, all the answers to your satisfactions, but at least I'm trying to provide them based on kind of my experience and what I have seen. Any questions so far? Okay. So now this section is devoted to talking about sample corner cases, that is, things that I happen to work in the last 3 years. I won't be doing any live demo. I won't be clearly identifying the clients. There are a number of reasons for that. But I'm going to hopefully describe those projects sufficiently to give you an idea what they were about and provide you some visuals that may help you understanding what was involved. I am also open to questions should you wish to explore a given project or area kind of deeper. All right, so the first one is Legacy Archaeological Dive. There's the cryptic name for that one. So what we are dealing with here is a legacy system that was created in the 1990s that has become no longer available. At the same time, it was kind of crucial for the operation of agency that employed it because the system processed something like $6 billion per year that had to do with distribution of social services funds between the state and the counties and vice versa, and kind of managing, supervising, auditing, all that stuff. Now, it was clear that the system needs replacing, but in the environment in which all of that took place, the proper procedure first is to prepare sufficient information for creation of RFP, request for proposals, and kind of bidding game and contracts. If you don't really have sufficient information about the system that you want to replace, there's basically no point starting the game, and effectively you cannot go through effective replacement. So before replacing the existing system, for which basically all know-how and documentation was lost or not available, what was needed was use cases, business rules, some component realization model in order to assess complexity and areas of risk or areas of importance, navigation, control, data flows, and so forth. So the main challenge was that no implementation documentation, no know-how was available anymore. It had to be dug out in some way. Moreover, implementation language, Pharo, which is some extended dialogue of debates, people old enough may remember what that was, has really no grammar available, and it's pretty complex language with myriad of variations. Manual analysis was completely impractical in the time frame, within the time frame available. At the same time, fully automatic analysis was impossible, mainly because of the absence of the grammar. Creating a grammar by trial and error would take too much time. There was no time for that. Now, tooling used in the project was Pharo and the decompiler. Spark EA stands for Enterprise Architect. This is kind of modeling tool that was used for the functional side of things. Then Pharo 4, Glamour Toolkit, Parser Stuff, Russell 2 telescope with some modifications. Now, the outcome of the work that involved using Pharo involved things other than use cases. I mean, use cases cannot be established using any form of magic that can be performed within Pharo in some automatic way that was done through normal kind of procedures of analyzing documents, talking to surviving SMEs, subject matter experts, and so forth. So what was built and created during using Pharo was an environment for examining relationships between or among realization artifacts to support basically investigation and understanding of the system. Nowadays, this idea is somewhat more popular and present, visible, but it was more than 3 years ago, and it was a bit different, at least for me. One of the important outcomes was kind of mapping of realization artifacts to use cases and among themselves, and gathering within some model that was devised ad hoc what kind of relationships translate into what kind of application. I'm going to talk about it in more detail in the next slide. Any questions so far? No? Everybody's good? Okay. Okay, so I'll take a moment then.
So, Piotr, one question. You call it a realization artifact. Is that merely a label, or do you construct some class to represent a realization?
Yes. I'll show it here. All right. So that's already an outcome, a kind of spit out from all this kind of machinery that was created within Smalltalk, kind of island parsing of the Pharo code. So it basically tells you that the system is composed of so many tables, so many programs, and in dbase/Pharo, programs can also be attached to screens, reports, and kind of libraries. This is kind of how it works in this environment. 126 screens, so many reports, and whatever. Now, the upper part basically shows all those components strung together, right, in this kind of blockish type of arrangement. What you can see there is a color coding. So, for example, green one is for tables, purple, I think it is for reports, yellow, I think it was for screens, and the orange one, I think it was for programs, right? Now, So the top one was the original one that was kind of shown in one of the original meetings with the client. And there were kind of some discussions and some resistance to allocating sufficient time for the work that was needed. Now, when the next diagram was shown, right, the problem went away, right? So what you see here, that is all those elements, they were basically instances of proper reified representations of realization artifacts. And also all the relationships were also reified as classes. Right, so all of that was basically instantiated and linked together. Now, what you see at the bottom is just one of a number, it's just an example of a number of types, relationship types that were identified for the analysis of the system. Sure.
And what's X and Y in the top diagram?
There is really no X and Y here, it's just arbitrary arrangement. So, special organizations of those components has no special meaning. It is just one of many possible representations, and you will see in the next slide that there were facilities to arrange it in some other way, but given the number of the elements, that was the most compact representation of it. So at the bottom, you see a sample of one of the relationship types that were kind of analyzed. So for example, components interacting with tables, the number opens UI, screens opening UI, executes, and so forth. And from kind of combining those different metrics, one could guess with some level of reliability what was the type of the system that we are dealing with. So, for example, the percentage of direct screen to tables, direct interactions, which was like 50% of those interactions, suggests that this is more or less direct data entry, system. Then also the number, again, almost half of tables reports versus screen tables interaction suggests that this is report generation app. That those two things are kind of fundamental to the functioning of the thing. Also, user-initiated interactions in the screens, there is some big number, basically suggests that the support for any notion of business process is fundamentally non-existent, and so forth, right? Okay, so let's now have a look at the kind of snapshot of different elements of the environment that was built that made those things possible. This is kind of scratching the surface because there is much more to it than could be shown in one slide. But I hope it gives you some idea as to what the thing was about. I understand it requires some level of imagination, but I trust in your imaginative abilities. That was a joke, by the way. Okay, so what you see here on the left-hand side is the use cases model that was created within Sparks. What you see on the other side of the screens are different kind of tools that made it possible to kind of navigate and link together different realization artifacts. So for example, there is use case browser. From the use case browser, you could see all the elements that were related or involved participating in a given use case. For each of them, you could bring a kind of focus element and follow, navigate the elements either related to or from or transitively related, and also provide some comments or corrections based on the knowledge that you may otherwise have. At the bottom, you have some summary, 24 cases, 126 screens. All of that were kind of navigable things. You clicked on that, you had a visual representation of those, a tabular representation of those, and you could pick them up and kind of work with them, navigate them. So analysis of use case, this UC101, kind of shows how it works in a kind of default form without changing the layout. You can see in the menu at the top that there is a kind of a layout drop-down menu, and there's like 10 different formats that can be applied in order to better arrange things. Most of them didn't really work very well. So some kind of manual operation would be required, but you could persist the workspace in order to keep the formatting. You could also drill down into kind of particular elements. For example, this analysis of execute, it really is about examining the relationship between two programs and what they entail. Right? The source code was available, kind of linked together to those elements, so you could look at the source code and figure out different things, including some material for analysis of business rules. In the lower right corner, you have some generated picture of the navigation, which is also important from the point of view of kind of figuring what the system is about and talking with the users because they understand the system from the point of view of navigation. So that's basically it. It would be more fun to do it kind of live, but I'm afraid that we don't really have much time for that, and I suspect I'm really kind of too lazy to go back 3 years and kind of resuscitate the environment. But the point to be made in this case is that this type of approach is probably promising in the sense that I have seen a number of kind of legacy analysis supporting systems, and none of them, to my recollection, could do even a fraction of the stuff that this can do. And that's not, I don't really say that for self-edification, but rather as an indication of potentially further direction and testimony to the power of the environment and the frameworks that were used within this solution. Any questions?
Yes.
Go ahead.
So could you open source the Fox Pro parser?
Well, I could if I had it.
You don't have, no, but even the Island Grammar one, something even partial, because like that, if people want to continue, like that, they have something to start with.
Well, that's something to explore. The only thing that kind of needs looking into is that even though 95% or even 99% of what I'm showing was written by me, it doesn't necessarily mean that I have kind of legal ownership of it.
Okay, yes.
And this is in the US, right? So litigation is national sport, right? So that has to be kept in mind.
And I have another question. I'm not sure that I understood. Did you also extract information from the enterprise modeling tool, this SparkX?
No, it was not extracted. It had to be, use case model had to be created by hand. There is no way of magically doing it.
No, I was thinking that maybe they add some use cases and that you could extract them from this other tool and from the source.
Okay, if you mean what I think you mean, then the answer is yes. That is, you could create representation within Pharo environment of the use cases that correspond to the diagram. That's not that difficult. But the creation of the use case model itself, right, you have to do it manually, right? There is no magic there. Yeah?
Is this an entirely static system that you analysed, or was it changing as you were building the analysis?
I think you have to ask a bit more for me to understand what the question is about.
Was the system under any kind of active development? Was it changing as you were performing the analysis?
Not anymore. It was as good as that. But in one sense, it was dynamic in that the kind of the frontier of understanding of the system was progressing, right? That was the idea, that you start with stuff that can be extracted from statistical analysis, and then by examining and having kind of environment and tools supporting this type of dynamic analysis, you understand more, right? You formulate some hypotheses and then you validate them or not, depending on whether it's possible or not, and you included it as another kind of element within the workspace. Yeah. It's okay? All right. It's too slow, sorry. Or do you want me to finish right now?
Next one.
Okay. They're all different, right? So don't worry. Okay, the next one is really about creating self-service data validation portals. The context is a large system with a budget of 500 million. It will probably go up to $1 billion before it really works. Now, if you integrate many financial systems into a single one, the thing to expect is that multiple data sources have to be migrated into a centralized one, and that migration requires very complex transformations and validations. So even if in some situations you can provide a canonical form of data to be used for the source data to be massaged into for importing into the target system, you still have to provide for validation of that data in a way that makes sense. There are many ways of doing validation of this kind, and importing of the data, and not too many of them make sense from the point of view of cost and scalability. So a typical way of doing it, kind of default way, is that you have a team or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of people who look after efforts of some, few hundred business units, each of them trying to squeeze data into some prescribed formats in Excel, and then FTP them somewhere. And some people do some combination of stored procedures and database operations that take usually minutes, that produce something that is not very easy to understand, and throw it back over the fence to the poor people who created data in the first place. So the idea in this case was that one can actually provide an element of progress in the story by adopting a few things. One, by introducing the notion of self-service, that is, some part of the validation process can be done on demand, whenever you want, however frequently you want, just by uploading your data to a portal, and the portal can do the validation for you, do the diagnostic, and give you all the information. And once with your data you reach a particular threshold of quality, then suddenly, magically, you have an option of kind of submitting it for further processing. And when this further processing takes place, when it completes, you also have notification from external systems that do some other validations and transformations about the problems that they encountered, if any, right? So that's the kind of idea. Now, in this case, the other issue was also to do this validation as quickly as possible. So, on one hand, if you use FTP, SFTP, and file transfers, the effective round trip of this data validation was measured in days. And the kind of labor cost of doing that was in man days, because there were so many people involved in the whole process. But these end users could not really do SFTP stuff because they didn't have proper skills. They had to look for other people to do that for them. It all takes time. Sometimes something doesn't work, and so forth. It takes almost forever. It doesn't scale. Also, the people who had to perform even relatively simple forms of validation, they are not scalable. They cannot work 25 hours per day, right? So there is a limit to. So in this case, the solution to the FTP problem was to upload it to a portal. And the solution to the speed problem was to basically work on the speed of the validation. And eventually it was quite successful because 10,000 records were validated like 0.7 second. So it was between page switches. I never really bothered even to implement kind of wait, kind of dialogue, wait, something is happening. It wasn't necessary, right? Now, the speed also of processing had the other important side effect because basically a single instance of C-side kind of server with underlying kind of validation mechanism, it works basically on one CPU core. And when we have like 500 end users, non-technical users hitting the portal, then the time taken to process one thing kind of matters, right? So I really wanted to avoid having multiple instances going. Not that much because it's very difficult technically, but mainly because of the kind of infrastructure context, right? That is, having sticky sessions and configuring F5s and all that stuff, it would basically take a week or two, and a lot of toing and froing that would detract from the proper mission. So that was important. Actually, in the exercise, I found that regular expression support within Pharo was at least 3 to 5 times too slow in order to be applied in this case. So by the end of the day, most of the validation was basically resolving into comparison of integers, so it was pretty fast. Okay, tooling, Pharo 5.6, C-side bootstrap plus extensions, NewOS, CD, data frame. Yeah, it was kind of for examination of data. Stone. I have also cannibalized elements of storyboard from data work, and the part that I liked a lot was a kind of representation of navigation in terms of mapping of events that proved a useful choice when kind of cloning the original portal into 2 other applications. Because the original notion of the portal who actually supported organizational hierarchy and constraints of visibility between that, all that was kind of baked in from the beginning, was also applicable to other types of data, including security data, right? Provisioning of security roles, not just authentication, but mainly authorization in this type of system is a complex thing. And I will show at some stage some kind of elements of the rules that are involved in the validation. So being able to, one, change navigation quickly and changing the mapping of events is one of the way of quickly doing that. And second, being able to have the solution that is specification driven in a sense, like interpreter pattern, right? That there is underlying kind of constant validation engine that is driven by different specifications that describe different constraints of the data, either at the level of field, row, or data set, or even in between data sets, right? This is the approach taken in this solution. That was also important because requirements were in constant flux. I will talk about it perhaps more in my other presentation on Thursday. By the way, the title of which is Guerrilla IT, not Gorilla. I mean, that sounds good, but it's not really about Gorilla, it's about Guerrilla. So I will talk more about that. If you're interested in those things, in this topic, then please come to the other talk. But the point is that the initial kind of design and concept was fortunate enough, so it was relatively simple to extend it to 3 other areas. And basically, after a year of operation, when people kind of got used to this way of doing things, they didn't have a problem with adopting it also in some other areas. 2 other areas were, one, data dealing with interfaces, which in the old world means basically data files. And the second one was time? Oh, well.
No, you have still some minutes.
How many minutes?
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay. All right, fine. Okay, I lost my train of thought. Doesn't matter. So, let's go here. So, this is kind of a trivial sample of the page, you know, what happens in a portal like that. You supply a data set, you know, you have some error, diagnosis, what's wrong with it, and so forth. Nothing exciting really. This is done with C-Site and Bootstrap. Actually, most time in this whole effort it took to replicate CSS that replicated the mandated CSS for the organization. Now, some samples of those kind of layout definitions that drive the validation engine. Here are kind of trivial things at the level of field. So you see there is a kind of type constraint, size constraint, optionality, mandatory or conditionally required, availability of the data. Then explicit error conditions, so you can specify user-facing messages on violation of specific constraints and so forth. That should give you some idea of how it works at the simplest level. This one shows more complex rules at the level of rows. So you can see that there are warnings, not only failures, and there are possibly some complex conditions involved in the understanding of the condition and so forth. This is just a glimpse. The most complex layout definition is something like 1,800 lines long, and there are kind of multiple interconnections between the rules and fields. It kind of gets complicated, at least to such a degree that it makes it impractical for humans to effectively do the validation, even if you had, you know, whole People's Liberation Army at your disposal to do that. Okay, so that's the last one of those kind of 3 corner cases. This is something ongoing and has to do with providing kind of chatbot services within a large financial system. There are a number of problems with kind of trying to understand how it works, at least in case of IBM Watson. Part of the problem is kind of ambiguities in documentation. And it takes some time to figure out, for example, how authorization scheme works. They are talking about user ID and password, which is not user ID and password. It's something that is basically authentication token for a given service and so forth. So basically what it means is that you need to have a flexible way and simple way of interacting with the services to understand how it works. The second thing is so-called corpus, that is the knowledge base that basically drives the whole process. And I'll talk about it more in the next slide. So what you see in the background is the original form of the corpus, which is Excel. I mean, it's almost impossible to figure out what's going on, including what are the basic logical malformations that are present, right? So what you see in blue is kind of analysis using a telescope, representation of those elements in the corpus to point out what are the logical structural errors, and kind of in order to bring out some type of sane practices. The thing on the left, on the right in green, shows the kind of proposed structure. All of that is navigable. You can click, collapse, and whatever, move things around. Now, the other thing that has to do with interacting with the API, this is a kind of a sample snapshot from IntelliJ, open on what's on JDK API. So this thing in yellow that you don't quite see is cognitive complexity of methods should not be too high, which I think is kind of funny. It comes basically from the static analyzer within IntelliJ. So it gives you an idea that there are simpler ways of interacting with the thing, because logically it's basically a set of 50 REST calls. There's really nothing logically complicated about it, but the available API is made kind of public through GitHub by IBM, unnecessarily complex, and sometimes you can go crazy trying to understand what they are trying to do. So here is a kind of quick snapshot of a Pharo zinc teapot and Twilio that I have cannibalized to represent REST resources and kind of test the interaction. You can see the inspector at the bottom. This kind of cut off at the bottom, but basically shows that there are some missing things. Workspace ID is missing, right? And this kind of imports information that can save you a day or two of work. So this is kind of a lightweight sample of this corner case. What is possible going to happen in the future with that is some form of graphical editing of the the corpus for the end users, and also some kind of further development of the API within Pharo. So maybe if this is good enough, then it could become kind of publicly available. There are many providers of chatbot, not just IBM, Microsoft's and Google's, and many others, but most of them work along similar principles as REST calls. So this kind of work could be modifiably usable for other areas. Okay. All right, now, so this is the end of the sample corner cases, and given time constraints, I leave it for your consideration. When you think about it, what are visible similarities, perhaps any patterns or stuff like that, right? But let's leave it as I know. So I want to go, how many minutes do I have left? 5? Okay. Through some observations, reflections, stuff like that, areas where Pharo can be used successfully and so forth, right? So you get the drift. Further enterprise areas for Pharo. Okay. So that's kind of my opinion and my vision of things. Basically, any area with the following features is a promising shot. Okay, so you have them listed. Now, what you have at the bottom that is not visible in its entirety, it helps, at least for starters, if there is an urgency about having the solution. It has a known non-eternal lifespan. It does not require massive scalability. Things of that kind. Any questions about that one? This is something to be pondered longer, but we don't obviously have time for pondering right now.
By out of the box, you mean thinking out of the box, not it versus
yes.
Out of the box.
Yeah, I always mean thinking, if nothing else. Okay. Introducing Pharo to non-friendlies. So what I have found is that Pharo can be used to provide a solution, but to tangible and clear business problems. Right? It's never really a good idea to try to sell it as a technical solution to technical problem. Don't make it a panacea, even though it's so great, it cannot fix some things. If the software development lifecycle is basically screwed up, Pharo won't help you, Smalltalk won't help you, there's no remedy for that. Do not introduce it solely on its technical merits. The thing that is not visible is the point that this is likely to be a non-starter or even an end to the conversation, and you want to avoid that, right? You don't introduce Smalltalk, or you don't introduce Pharo as Pharo. You introduce it as basically a set of tools that help something happen that is of importance. That's the only same way that I have seen kind of happen. In the 1990s, that was a different story. They adopted Smalltalk because it was Smalltalk, but we are not in that era anymore. Okay, making Pharo acceptable, if you have to make it acceptable, which sometimes you can circumvent by not even saying that you use Pharo, delivering the solution in the first place, right? That's the complete basis, right? If something works, people don't ask you how it works, they are not interested. Adopting reasonable and so forth, testing to decrease reliance on the testing performed by others, which is usually bad quality. Making the solution modifiable and maintainable, improving the functional skill reliability over time in a predictable way. So these, in my experience, are kind of elements that can be used to build respectability, acceptability, that people don't complain, this is crazy stuff, but it works, so it's fine. Attractive facets of Pharo, it's kind of obvious for most of us. I'd like to draw your attention to the second point, which also contains a trace of a joke. Okay, so...
Wait, what do you want to say? I want to understand the stuff.
Which one?
On open source. Explain us this.
Well, open source. What I'm trying to say is that people think sometimes that in kind of corporate enterprise environments, the fact that something costs nothing in terms of money licenses is the critical factor. In fact, it isn't. The critical factor is rather than in critical situations you don't have time through going through the provisioning process, which may be very lengthy in some organizations. I'm not necessarily by definition against commercial Smalltalks at all. I spent a lot of time in my life with Visual Works and even Object Works before that, Visual Age and the others. But the fact is that there are some situations in which having open source working Smalltalk like Pharo is hard to beat. And it has nothing to do really with the environment as such, but rather the fact of how quickly you can put it in place. It's not a question of cost, it's really a question of bureaucratic overhead. Does it answer your question? Okay. So, yeah, I leave aside kind of all the others. I think they are more or less obvious. Now the areas of improvement, and here I would like to ask you not to take those kind of notes very personally, and keep in mind that they reflect also some of the biases and kind of choices that are forced by the situation of being independent and being under stress, being pragmatic and things like that. So one of the things that kind of drove me nuts personally was that there were many packages available, solutions, potentially useful ones, with no description whatsoever, and that kind of blows my mind. If you went through the effort of creating it in the first place, why cannot you provide, 2 sentences of description of the package? Why cannot you provide a class description or things like that? It's completely mind-boggling to me. It's like shooting yourself in the foot even before you made your first step. Improvements in version configuration control. Well, my main gripe is that I like things that work for me be kept. Don't, for example, Git file tree worked for me just fine. I have nothing against Iceberg, but it didn't work for me, right? And I don't have time to solve that problem. It's a worthy problem. It should be solved, but in some situations I just don't have time for doing that. I have to keep working on what worked for me. Right? So I used Git file tree and I used Git Kraken, you know, and basically it was not the problem that I was trying to solve. So thank you for Git file. Being clear about the status and roadmap of key components, you know, sometimes it's also a bit of a worry. It would be good to know where we are going in a more public way. Having reliable dependency specs, perhaps using continuous integration to test dependencies of key packages would be some form of solution. Okay, better information about the level of maturity of a given tool or package. Maturity levels in Squeak are useful. Better management of the release cycle. Perhaps we could adopt in the long run some kind of even odd-numbered stable bleeding edge releases, so people who are interested in stability can know that when they use, say, even-numbered releases, they are good, but if you are kind of bleeding edge fan and you want to push the envelope forward, then you go with the bleeding with the odd numbered, you know, release, something like Pharo 7 or whatever. The last point is relatively important. I think it deserves more attention than it has so far. Promoting how small operators, including the independents, can support development of Pharo with emphasis on the financial support and what this can buy everyone. So I am, for example, one of the willing victims, right? I want to pour cash back into the community, but I'd like to know better how it works. Perhaps this information is available, but then again, it's kind of not my task in life to try to find this information, right? We need to find some modus vivendi in terms of kind of making it work. Final thoughts. Okay, this is the last one. How much time have I got? 1 minute? Okay, this is the last slide, all right?
Coffee is outside, huh?
Okay, so it's a bit pretentious, but kind of forgive me. So, actually it's true, over the years I came to believe that the actual value of a piece of technology lies in its ability to change people's attitudes and behaviors in IT. And to me, Wiki is a kind of a standard example. Right? This is why it is useful, because it changes behaviors, patterns of behavior and kind of dynamics in the team. Not that much that, you know, every Joe can edit, you know, HTML page. It's kind of irrelevant. So my contention is that Pharo and Smalltalk has that ability, and most of you will probably agree. Now, the kind of thought underlying this presentation has been that starting with the small or the non-central, meaning the corner cases, within the big and the complex, meaning the enterprise, can help realize that capability while producing good usable solutions and making the enterprise a bit more bearable in the process if it's only possible. So that's the final thought to kind of be pondered and discussed. If you wanted to ask more questions or discuss further kind of the topics that I brought up only superficially, I'm available. So that's it. Thank you for your attention.